broadcasting from the Unshackled studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by the Unshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello everybody and welcome back to WilmsFront on this Thursday the 15th of May 2025. We are live on the WilmsFront YouTube channel, the WilmsFront Rumble channel and my WilmsFront X account. It is 7 p.m. here in Melbourne, Victoria, with more of the Australian federal election vote being counted. It has further cemented the win for the Albanese Labor government and confirmed the rout suffered by the Conservative side of politics. The Liberal Party has elected Susan Ley as its new leader, who is known for her lack of political conviction or principles, while the National Party has re-elected David Littleproud as their leader. The Senate results will take a few weeks to be confirmed by the magic buttons being pressed, but the only minor Freedom Party in with a chance of winning seats is One Nation. So where to from here for conservative ideology in Australia? My guest tonight will offer a path forward. Dan Ryan is the Executive Director of the National Conservative Institute of Australia. He's also a lawyer and a China expert, as it's pronounced now. Dan, welcome to WilmsFront.
Oh, delighted to be here, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
So first of all, what is national conservatism? Because there's already lots of different schools and subsets of conservatism.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember the compassionate conservatism of George W. Bush, and then there was Ross Rodriguez crunchy cons, and then there was neoconservatism and all the rest of it, right? I mean, national conservatism is much more of the type of conservatism that a Benjamin Disraeli would have agreed with, right? It is.
Explain to our audience who.
Benjamin Disraeli was the leader of the Conservative Party of Britain in the 19th century, and he was his famous political competitor was Gladstone, also a very impressive guy who led the Liberal Party. But it was the Liberal Party versus the Conservative Party in Britain, and they had different fundamental philosophies. And anyway, national conservatism is much more in tune with that traditional conservatism. And it's not just social issues, which is how conservatism has typically been portrayed in Australia. It has a much broader conception of how a state ought to be run, what policies should be in place so that our culture, our rights, R-I-T-E, and our way of life and our people can be transmitted to the next generation, not just simply focusing on a bundle of liberal axioms and whether they exist now and in perpetuity. So the focus is different. Sometimes liberals and conservatives agree on and both dislike the symptoms, but the underlying causes for why things occur, they come at it from very different means, from very different ends, yeah.
So liberalism and conservatism. So where is the difference?
Okay,
what are they?
So let me give you three clear examples of where national conservatism or traditional conservatives differs from liberalism of that we're used to today. So on trade, conservatives or national conservatives are much more skeptical about free trade. Liberals tend to think that any tax on a good crossing a border is an affront to man and heaven above. They view it in much more theological terms. Conservatives think it matters who you're trading with. There are consequences simply beyond the economic in assessing the type of trade arrangements that you have. Trading with New Zealand is different to trading with China. And there are consequences to the type of nation that you are if you have no industrial capacity, right? So that's one example where we differ considerably from the traditional Hawke, Keating, Howard sort of modern liberal era, at least in Australia. On immigration, the Conservatives are much more focused on ensuring that our people, continue to exist to the next generation. So Liberals will tend to say, oh, it doesn't matter in 50 years' time what language people speak in Australia or what belief system they have, as long as they maintain freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and all the rest of it. Conservatives say, well, that's you're not going to likely to be able to preserve those freedoms because they're a byproduct of a particular type of people. But secondly, that's not what actually you want. You want to be able to pass on your culture to the next generation. You shouldn't be neutral about that. You shouldn't just be sitting here going, well, I don't care. Australia's a free trade zone and an open economy to whoever want to comes here. Now that's a fundamental difference between the liberal view and the conservative type of view. And then on foreign policy, Conservatives typically have a much more kind of realist or prudent approach to where we should get involved in the world. The liberal interventionist approach that we're all used to now over the last 30 years has manifestly failed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Libya, and all the rest of it. But there's been no real apology by the guys who are responsible for that. And conservatives, traditional conservatives, from the times of Disraeli, were much less concerned about remaking the world according to these sort of liberal axioms, and much more concerned about what it actually means. What are the realistic limits on our power? What does it actually mean? Does it really serve our own national interest? And so there are three clear examples: foreign policy, immigration, and trade, where conservatism is making a comeback, and where the flag needs to be planted here in Australia again.
Thinking of the more contemporary commentators, is it fair to say that the commentator who probably closest espouses national conservatism would be Tucker Carlson?
He definitely gets it. I think traditional conservatism. He's changed in the last 10 years. I follow him closely. He's an excellent communicator. He does it, as you know, in a very chatty style. He has a wide variety of guests. Not all of them I'm on the same page with, but I think fundamentally on trade, immigration, and foreign policy, he would be absolutely on the same page.
I'm not sure if you saw him when he toured Australia.
I did, yeah, I did.
He was excellent, and certainly when the Welcome to Country debate dominated some of the final week of the campaign, Tucker Carlson talking about why would people say that you need to be welcome to your own country so they can take it away from you.
Oh, he was great. Yeah, he it was his first time in Australia. I saw him in Brisbane. He was a bit cautious about making too grand claims about a country he's only just visited, but he kind of picked up the essence of it pretty quick. I think he was impressed with Australia generally in terms of our quality of life. And I think I've heard him say afterwards that he thinks that we still have more of a middle class and a common culture here than exists in the United States. But he also recognizes that is dramatically changing. And yeah, I think he was a bit flabbergasted by the low quality of the Australian media, frankly. There was a famous scene at the National Press Club where he just sort of expertly took them apart for their inane questionings. And yeah, I think he made commentary throughout his tour, and certainly did in Brisbane, about immigration, about foreign policy, and about, he touched on trade as well, I think.
Well, certainly mainstream media. I'm not sure if all the blame can be put on them for convincing Peter Dutton and the Liberal national leadership during the campaign to run as far as they could from any association with Donald Trump, as the media was talking about the volatility in the global markets, the unpredictability, and Peter Dutton said, "I'm not like Trump at all. I'm more John Howard, Peter Costello." What did you think of that approach?
Again, I just thought that it was a low quality discussion, focusing too much on individual personalities. like it should have been possible to have a broader rethinking on key policies in Australia that in some cases adopt Trump, the policies that he's adopted, or policies that have been adopted in Europe and elsewhere. I mean, we are increasingly the odd man out in Australia on this, without being labelled, a Trump clone or what have. I accept like Donald Trump is an acquired taste. I find him funny at times. I also find him a bit kind of cringe at times. But he has succeeded and been elected at least twice in the most competitive political market in the world. He has brought together a whole bunch of, billionaires, people at the top of their field. He does have a coherent program, which is why people like JD Vance, who initially were much more in the, I guess probably would have fitted into Australian Liberal Party, in the last election, but he changed his tune because he's smart enough to get how Trump has changed things. And so when you've got an intelligible program, you can pull people from all different ways of life that aren't simply whether they're fans or not of the individual who happens to be leading the ticket.
And Anthony Albanese during the campaign said that Australia, we're our own country, without mentioning when he said we don't need to borrow from other countries, didn't say who he was referring to or what country he was referring to. Today he was on the Nine Newspapers podcast and talked about progressive patriotism. And I remember in his victory speech he talked about doing things the Australian way and basically attempting to embody that he and the Labor Party are the true stand for Australian values. And obviously the media have echoed this, but there is a lot of people trying to create that or claim that there's this consensus that Australia is a country that we do things our own way. We're different from other Anglosphere countries, including on cultural issues. So it's a mistake to try and import culture wars from the US and the UK.
Yeah, look, the politicians, they read their polls, even though they recognize that there is an appetite in the community for patriotism, that people do like their flag, they like the resurgence in support for Anzac Day and Australia Day. I think what neither side actually gets is that it's not just more waving the flag or, Albanese's claim to sort of more accurately embody the kind of patriotism of the nation or whatever he was trying to say there. There needs to be a framework which actually preserves and protects the nation state. So, at the last election, there was no difference between the two major political parties on trade. Both of them said, no, we need to have 100% manufactured goods from China to continue to come in duty-free. Well, as long as that continues to occur, you will never be able to have any sort of industrial base here in Australia, despite all the kind of slogans about building the future in Australia again, or building nuclear power. I mean, Ohio has nuclear power. Ohio has much more flexible labor relations. Ohio has lower taxes than Australia could probably ever dream of, but they still had their the heartland, industrial heartland, gutted because of their trade policy. Unless you change that, you will not change the industrial makeup of Australia, and you need to. And I do think that in due course, the mainstream corporate world in Australia and the intellectual class here on the right and the left will be embarrassed about their position that they have held on trade with respect to China and indeed many other countries.
That's a pretty, I would say, pretty bold prediction. I did see that this article that was published in the Financial Review, Hawke and Keating were wrong. There is a strong case for tariffs, but it was interesting reading it further down. You also mentioned quite rightly that Australia is soaking in taxes and regulations. My counter argument to the case for tariffs is that there is a lot that Australia can do to make itself more competitive, and obviously the net zero bipartisanship, which I don't really know where Liberal and Nationals are going to end up on this question, but for Chris Bowen, it's full steam ahead with solar and wind, and also, well, tenure plebiscite's been moved from environment, but the blocking of the gold mine, also the delay on the North Shelf gas project. There is so much that, how to use my website's own name, there's so much that could be done to unshackle Australia's resources, manufacturing. It's the fact that well, when I say we've let our governments just cripple our natural advantages.
Sure, but it's sort of, look, I don't like taxes. I said that in the article, right? But it's weird, I think, in Australia, the political class, their purest attitude to a tax on a good crossing a border, which is a position held, I think even the Greens probably hold it, but then they're fine to say, well, let's raise the GST to 15%, or let's impose additional taxes on super. It's completely.
I don't support any of that.
No, I understand that, but I think what needs to happen. We had at the moment in Australia, and I lived in China and worked in China and advised companies. In Australia, we've created a red zone. So if you try to do anything productive here, you are taxed and regulated beyond belief. So the whole incentives are created to get your business out of Australia if you can. And if you do, you can send those goods being produced in Thailand or Bangladesh or China or wherever back into Australia duty-free. Hooray, you're out of Australia. You get to be in the green zone. And the only industries that remain now in Australia in the red zone are industries that can't be shifted, like mining, real estate, tourism, and some of the industries, which ancillary industries which support those, like banking. So that is very different to the type of economy that existed in Australia before we decided to get rid of a tariff war completely. And again, trade policy can be done well or done poorly. I'm not saying that tariffs have to go to 1,000% or whatever, but people need to be able to think constructively again about trade policy. Like, as I mentioned in the article, all of the American presidents on Mount Rushmore, all of our great prime ministers prior to Gough Whitlam, who was the first one to actually institute major tariff cuts. It's not so much as, whether individually you think, it should be another tax on a goods crossing a border. It's a whole rethinking of the tax structure of Australia. So we incentivize production of real things here, rather than simply being an open borders economy, a consumer economy that imports everything it needs from elsewhere, and only the only wealth it generates really is from stuff that can't, like I said, that can't be moved offshore.
I agree that there needs to be massive reductions in the tax and regulatory burden in Australia. And obviously that is something that the conservative side of politics, Liberals and Nationals, neglected. They going to the election opposing, even though it was a tiny tax cut. That was, I couldn't believe that. And Dutton at one stage, when he was on a podcast with The Australian, floated the idea of indexing tax rates. I mean, the fact that we have, it's that almost half of your income goes to tax, that's just unbelievable.
It's insane. And you got to ask yourself, how do we get to this point? Because that was not what was promised when the so-called great liberalizations of the 80s were introduced, right? were we told that we would end up with debt as far as the eye could see, personal and public debt? Were we told that our economy would be deindustrialized? I bet you, because they made these same arguments in the United States, I bet they said, no, it will actually increase our manufacturing because we will be more efficient to be able to import what we need for the growth of our manufacturing industry, and we'll get all these new additional markets. Didn't happen at all. We have less people devoted to manufacturing in Australia than we do prior to federation. That's how ridiculous it is.
Well, the government spends a lot more now.
Yeah.
The National Disability Insurance Scheme, I mean, that's where a lot of the employment growth is, or what Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, tries to call the care economy, when it's just spending.
But in a way, Tim, it's the government stepping in because they've completely hollowed out and gutted all those industries where people did used to soak up people in legitimate employment. So they've had to instead to just to bend a knee to political reality, throw all this government funds to make into roundabout deep make work programs, whether in education, like in the care economy, and all the rest of it, like you say. So it's just, I think people just need to step back who have wallowed in this sort of Hawke, Keating, Howard mantra, and reassess critically that sort of whole policy framework, because that's what needs to really occur if we're going to sort of get us out of the mess that we're in. And it will be a struggle for people who grew up during that time, both journalists, and made their reputation in promoting it, because there's such a mythology attached to it. It's a struggle to people in the Never Trump, of the Never Trumpers in the United States, who likewise just think we need to get back to, if we just need good old Ronald Reagan back, it would all, or Margaret Thatcher, it would all sort its stuff out. And they don't appreciate, we live in different times and different policy solutions are required, but that also within, great though they were in many ways, there were flaws within that policy framework which over time have manifested itself. And look, it's destroyed the Liberal Party of Australia. It's destroyed, conservatism here. It's completely upended politics across the Western world. So step back and work out, okay, well, clearly what we have been doing, what the centre-right, mainstream centre-right have been doing, it hasn't borne the fruits that were promised. It's borne some of them, but there are some major flaws in the kind of policy framework which need to be corrected. And we need to be a lot less doctrinaire and a lot more kind of realistic about actually what is happening out there in the real world, both in foreign policy, trade, and immigration. All these things that we'll go on to until policy changes.
In the chat, Zach Hook says, "What has conservatism actually ever conserved in Australia? Hasn't worked. It's just so boring." And then he finishes off with, "Be racist."
So good on you, Zach. Hey, but I would argue that the mantra from the centre-right party in Australia, at least until recent times, the dominant one, is called the Australian Liberal Party. And that name is unique amongst the Anglo-sphere nations. The Conservative Party of Canada doesn't call itself the Liberal Party. They're the opposition. The Republicans call their opposition Liberals. In the UK, it's the Conservative Party, right? The British Liberal Party died out in the 1920s. So there's always been a classical liberal philosophy of the late 19th century, which is supposedly what the Liberal Party Australia is its founding ideology. Although I just think people get their history wrong. Long story short, it's liberalism, not conservatism, which has done so much damage to our institutions, our way of life, and our economy and our nation state. We've been practicing liberalism, or at least trying to, and we're seeing the results of that. What we need to actually practice is conservatism. That's the key difference. Yeah.
Well, in the aftermath of it's the worst defeat for the Liberal Party of Australia in its history, since it was founded by Sir Robert Menzies in 1944. I mean, the only greater defeat was its predecessor, the United Australia Party. And what they all agree on it, the these Liberal MPs, those who are ex-MPs, those who are part of the organisational wings, they say that our values that Sir Robert Menzies founded the party on don't need to change. Our "we believe" statement is perfect. We just need to get back to that and start from there.
Yeah, look, people always invoke the name of Menzies. Menzies was not in favour of free trade. Menzies had a much more realistic position on immigration, right? Menzies was not in favour of, getting rid of the monarchy or much more in favour of established religion. He would have had his mind blown by things like gay marriage and the rest of it, right? Because he was he had conservative instinct, and actually, if you look into it, as much of a fan of Disraeli as Gladstone, he sort of recognized the importance of both those different philosophical strands of thought. Now, so the first point to make is that the Liberal Party's philosophy on some of those core issues has actually changed fundamentally since the days of Menzies, and they've just become untethered to healthy, sensible nationalism and conservatism, and they haven't recognized that liberalism can be a very destructive philosophy, destructive, to institutions, destructive to the nation state, destructive to our industry, and that's a core part of the problem. I mean, in my view. So when we talk about these amorphous values, great. There's actually a large, there's a lot of Liberal Party of Australia's made up a lot of civic-minded, patriotic, middle-class people who want the best for the country. If that's what they mean by values, great. But you're allowed to adjust your policy settings in a significant way in order to try to achieve the goal, which is actually the preservation of the Australian middle class in Australia. And the current policy framework is not doing that.
So the counter argument is that the Liberal Party needs to better reflect modern Australia, which was obviously different from 1944. I think Susan Ley, the new leader, used the term modern Australia 3 times in about 30 seconds. And then you have former Liberal MPs such as Christopher Pyne, George Brandis and Simon Birmingham saying we need to get back to the sensible centre where elections are won. And then you have current MP Andrew Bragg saying that, look, we need to be a party that's focused on freedom, both in the boardroom and the bedroom, basically saying we need to get rid of the culture wars such as the trans issue and just focus on the economic and live and let live attitude.
Yeah, I found some of that commentary by George Brandis, Christopher Pyne, and Simon Birmingham bewildering, because they all hark back to a speech that Theresa May gave back in 2002, which says, we can't beat the Conservative Party, can't beat
and
the
that's
nasty
what
party.
Christopher Pyne said when he was guest on the Gruen transfer.
They all make reference to this. It's an article of faith, and my response to that is like, dudes, have you picked up a British newspaper lately? No one in Westminster thinks that David Cameronization of the British Conservative Party is the answer going forward. That's lunacy suggestion. No one in Europe thinks that, the answer is just like a more Cameron-esque type of remodeling of the centre right in those countries. Political success that Donald Trump received in the United States didn't come from being touchy-feely and empathetic. It came from quite kind of bold policy suggestions. And it was what people consistently miss is that people didn't vote for the guy because he had, did some wacky rallies. He did it. They did it because they agreed with his policy prescriptions on trade, immigration, and foreign policy. I'm almost, it just boggles my mind sometimes that in Australia we haven't got that. We're still focusing on Trump the deal maker, or Trump this or Trump that, and just look at it and think, because I think, many of the major broadsheets, their journalists their formative years were during the 80s and 90s. They've had this sort of sense of mission that they were opening Australia and doing all the rest of it and being more liberal and progressive and the rest of it. And they simply have not been able to adjust and look around the world and come to the realization Australia's the odd man out now. It's crazy. I mean, we have had no serious reassessment of our trade policy. We're still operating like it's 1996 with respect to China and everywhere else. There's been no apologies really from the mainstream parties, or no clear evidence that the foreign policy prescriptions of the last 30 years in all those countries that we're trying to remake have been a complete and utter disaster by and large. And on immigration, I mean, like the last election, it was sitting there, the biggest issue in Europe, in the UK, in the United States. And at best, there was a sort of trimming of the edges by Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party, and Albanese making some other sort of muted noises that they'll get it under control in a way they didn't do over the last 3 years. I mean, you've got it. That doesn't matter. Like, you know, that's just there's serious policy changes that need to happen. I couldn't care less what Donald Trump is doing. I couldn't care less what these other people are doing. I want to change, you know, the policy framework here, because it's not working.
The way that the US and the UK are different to Australia is that they are still getting flooded with illegal immigration. I mean, it's more extraordinary in the UK, given that they are an island. But in Australia, there is zero tolerance for illegal immigration. I mean, John Howard won the 2001 election by pledging to stop the boats and saying, we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. And the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, one of the major contributors to its landslide defeat was that the boats returned. And the Albanese government, they have kept offshore processing. They have turned boats around. So
yeah, but Tim, our success at stopping illegal immigration, at least those that attempt to come to illegally by sea, is not the problem anymore, right? Our problem is mass immigration, legal mass immigration by and large, that we've allowed in. There was an interesting survey that Matthew Goodwin, the political scientist, did in the UK, and he asked the population there, would you prefer that the boats are stopped or that mass immigration, legal mass immigration, is stopped? Overwhelmingly, they said, stop the legal mass immigration. And John Howard at the time made a line, used a line, which he still uses, I think, to this day, along the lines of, it was because we stopped illegal immigration that the public have been much more accepting about a large-scale immigration program. I don't know. I've never seen clear polling on that. If that were true at the time, I do not believe it is true now by any stretch of the imagination. And yes, the illegal immigration in the United States, it just boggles the mind. It's on a scale, but it's mass immigration which has been the problem. You know, in Europe and elsewhere, like mass immigration is actually a much bigger problem even than illegal immigration by and large now in Australia and most other Western
mainland
countries.
Europe, a lot of that is illegal immigration as well, from when the migrant crisis first began.
Yeah, but Merkel let them in. Like Merkel in Germany famously let Syrian,
which was basically saying that, there's no such thing as illegal immigration anymore. With
Boris Johnson, the Boris wave, which I just literally yesterday, Keir Starmer announced he's going to try to put an end to. I mean, Boris Johnson, those dramatic numbers, they're all legal by and large. And yes, they had some people crossing the channel, the English Channel, but those numbers in comparison to what they let in legally, we were, you know, it's a small fry, really.
Though there has been this pivot in Australia, migration from Islamic immigration, then there was Chinese immigration, but when Xi Jinping started to put up the bamboo curtain again, there was sort of this realization, the Chinese Communist Party, they view all of the Chinese here as still part of their country, and view them as these sleeper cells ready to activate if there's a threat to the interests. And so then there's been this pivot to Indian mass migration, particularly post the COVID border opening. So and it's been, a lot of it has been Ponzi immigration to prop up the budget and employment and the economy. But the strategy seems to be we'll have our immigration mix so that there's less to put it bluntly, there's less chance of race riots.
Yeah, I don't know whether there's actually been a conscious policy, because we do run a non-discriminatory immigration program. We don't select. We don't say, okay, we're going to take some more.
It's hard to notice the change, though.
No, absolutely. We have taken. I think the best way of saying it is a lot more, because of the arrangements we've put in place. It has enabled a lot more Indian students and legal immigrants to come to Australia than was previously the case, and that has increased further because of the labour arrangements that were put in place after the trade agreement, recent trade agreement that we put in place with India. So yes, they've increased dramatically. There's still a lot of Chinese immigration as well. Not every Chinese is a sleeper.
Oh well, I'm
spy.
saying that's what the CCP. That's how they want.
Oh yeah, they do want to exert their influence, but so does the Indian community government to some extent as well, right? I mean, I sometimes think in conservative circles, we're like the attitude, and I think I've heard Tony Abbott say this. I certainly see it, that China bad, India good, and we need to sort of like India's because they supposedly embody the rule of law and everything else. They're so much more superior partner to China.
They like cricket as well.
They have different issues, right? And not everything. Yeah. So we want to. It also creates a whole lot of problems in Australia as well, different problems and the rest of it. So you want to be able to. This whole, I do think in a whole variety of different policy areas, both sides just become so doctrinaire. Let's get real. We have been successful in Australia and we have avoided so many of the ethnic tensions and disputes, and we've been a high trust society because of a particular immigration program that we followed until 30 plus years ago. Now you can adjust that slightly if you want to. There have been advantages here and there, but you need to just because a little bit of immigration is added to the mix, it doesn't mean that let's just ramp it up to extremes because more spice equals tastier food. At some point you wreck your food, you wreck your recipe. So it's so much of this it's so simplistic the way it's presented, as though immigration is this abstract thing. Well, some people, it matters how many and what and whom and why they're coming. You can't be saying you're pro-immigration or anti-immigration is almost like a meaningless statement. But that's how our political discourse is operated. He's anti-immigration, as though from where, from who, what does that even mean? So people, by and large, Tim, not to make it too long-winded, but it just needs to be a big dose of reality into our political discourse, so that people actually can just start discussing things properly and realistically.
There's also the policy of multiculturalism, which it seems that the modern Liberal Party is not opposing. I mean, Peter Dutton was doling out money to various Chinese and Indian associations, and they're all there at the Chinese New Year with the big dragon, and also at the various Indian events where they're all dressed up in the sort of Bollywood dance things. So they're
I'm all up for kind of small creative minorities in society. I think it's delusional to try to create a pure ethnic state. They exist. Japan's pretty ethnically homogenous.
Pressure being put on them to allow mass migration because of their aging population, which again is the justification here in Australia for mass migration.
Yeah, they're still a pretty rich society. Anyway, bottom line, in John Howard's time, he was against multiculturalism. In fact, he changed the name of the department. But again, these guys, he ramped up immigration to quite serious levels even, before he departed. And doesn't really matter how good your civics program is. It doesn't matter what you name, whether you rename it the Immigration Department or the Department for Multicultural Affairs, the Department for Citizenship. If you have dramatic numbers, doesn't matter how good your policies are, you're not going to be able to create the same type of assimilative sort of magic as you did when you had a different cohort from more similar cultures that were brought to Australia in different times. So it's not like it's not a healthy thing, multiculturalism. It effectively means that you're sort of deconstructing the culture of your nation, which is unique and precious, and what your ancestors and everyone else have fought for over the years. You can add to it and you can graft it at the edges, but you have to be really careful about doing that. And simply saying we need more civics programs, or we need to change the Department of Multicultural Affairs, or we need to have a debate about multiculturalism. Yeah, great, but just lower the numbers dramatically, and that'll save the need for. It'll actually solve the debate more than any grand rhetoric.
Are we? This is what I've pondered. Are we at the point of no return? Obviously, another difference between Australia and European countries is that there's. In Germany, for example, I've lost count of the mass casualty events, car attacks by illegal immigrants. Like, thankfully, in Australia, we don't see this only very rarely. But going back to the point that I was going to make is that we've got the census next year, and we've had the Liberal Party. Well, a lot of the free advice that they're getting is that they need to communicate better with migrant communities. So the new deputy, Ted O'Brien, so he's a Mandarin speaker, and he said we need to stop thinking of Chinese Australians as different. They are Australians. So it sounds like they're going to double down on, like Tony Abbott talking about the Liberal Party being the party of migrants in that video with Rattenberg, that literal car crash candidate.
Well, I mean, all these people, they sort of walk both sides of the street, because on one hand, Tony Abbott, I think he had an article in the Australian, if not yesterday, the day before, where he talked about immigration being the elephant in the room and how we need to crack down on it. And at the same time, as you mentioned, he had during the campaign a big promo where he said the Liberal Party is the party of immigrants. Well, that doesn't even allowing for a certain latitude in a political campaign. Just work out what you think. Should we be a mass immigration country or not? Marco Rubio,
the migrant communities are already here from further migration. This is sort of. They're trying to distinguish that, even the recent migrants, they wouldn't want more floods to come in. This is sort of what I call the disassociation.
Yeah, well, great. That you can make that argument. I mean, some people would want even stronger than that, but make that argument and cut the numbers. Like, you can't. They're not. There was no serious proposal at the last election to cut the numbers. Anything like has been proposed in the UK. I mean, they haven't actually put a cap.
I'll believe it when I see it.
Oh, absolutely. No, I'm hugely skeptical. In fact, the public is usually skeptical about politicians' words on immigration. But there wasn't really it should have been a referendum on immigration the last election, and it wasn't. It was a whole grab bag of policies across the board, which none of them were poorly understood. I saw John Howard asked about the gas reservation policy.
That was another, could anyone understand it?
So it really, the most important issue the existential issue across the Western world is immigration. Okay, treat it seriously. Treat it like it needs to be a sensible nationalism. You need to work out. You're not going to be, we don't want violence. We want sensible, constructive ways of addressing the issue and incorporating and molding a new people again in Australia, with the people we have, Chinese backgrounds or whatever. But you don't get that, and it's irresponsible and it's culturally careless to continue the large numbers. It's just you are wrecking the country in the name of, because you want to maintain your high moral ground, and you don't want to sully your hands by discussing the issue properly. Sorry, you're going to have you're going to invite far worse consequences than you would have than you would experience if you weren't to just focus on the issue and address it directly.
I interrupted you before we knew you were going to make another point. About Marco
I don't
Rubio.
know. Is it? Oh, well, but so Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, he's famously Cuban parents. He said in his inauguration hearings, his nomination hearings for Secretary of State, the era of mass migration is over. Can you imagine anyone in the political scene in Australia saying the same thing? The age of mass migration in Australia is over. Well, that's what our largest ally is doing. Of a guy who has Hispanic or whatever background, but you can make that argument plainly, in a articulate way like he does. Why can't we make it here? Why can't Susan Ley come out and say that? Why can't Ted O'Brien come out and say that? No one's going to consider the Liberal Party, a neo-Nazi party if they make those arguments in a sensible way. Keir Starmer is making, again, with a healthy dose of skepticism, he's making now very noises about being very restrictive on immigration going forward. So just be mature and adult about it and tackle it directly.
I'll tell you another where Australia is different from certainly the UK. I mean, the fact that the grooming gangs were allowed to operate without much impunity for 20 plus years. But in Australia, when there were those Western Sydney rape gangs, they were successfully prosecuted. There was zero tolerance for that.
Yes.
So it was sort of nipped in the bud.
I interviewed on my own podcast Carl Scully, who was the Minister for Police at the time, and he wrote a book about the Cronulla riots and went in a little bit to those issues. And we had the great, Margaret Cunneen, who was a prosecutor at the time.
Excellent.
She went after them. I do worry, we didn't have we had. It all matters the people that come from, right? We had an issue with from a particular part of Lebanon that had been let in too easily and had very backward views on things. The UK had a very much larger population from the Indian subcontinent than we do. And, it was predominantly Pakistani gangs, which were preying on predominantly white British women, although they're also Sikh victims as well, and they're also Sikh perpetrators, I believe, too, and they're also Indian perpetrators as well. But let's be real about the people that were doing it. We haven't had the same level of immigration from from Pakistan. If we do, I worry that we maybe have congratulated ourselves a bit too soon, and I do worry, given the large influx, that we may see in Australia the same type of phenomenon, if it's not occurring already out there, and our political class will not be as courageous as they once were, and will effectively ape what the UK establishment have done and pretended it's racist to even raise the issue, and ignored it and cracked down on people who have been brave enough to raise it. I don't have a huge amount of confidence at the moment that our political class is so much different to the UK political class that they will handle the problem if it expands further in Australia today.
I think that there was when the Labor government, they were sort of nonchalant when those criminal detainees were released by that High Court decision, but because there was such community outrage, anger, they were forced to react, and so they did pass these extra laws. They haven't really used them, but the extreme people, if there's hurt against, well, children, the elderly, the vulnerable, the politicians, they react. So I think that's.
I want to believe that that's the case, Tim, but I just am increasingly worried that in the outer suburbs of our larger capital cities, with the new mix, that we may, like, that we may experience the same problem the UK has. If you introduce exactly the same elements, why are you going to get such a dramatically different result? Now, there may be particular types of, something to do with the environment in those formerly industrial towns in England, which led to particular vulnerabilities to predominantly white British girls. But I don't know. I think we should be absolutely vigilant and on guard about the prospect of that potentially occurring here, if it's not already occurring in some shape or form already. Because too much self-congratulation invites hubris, and then
the reason I'm mentioning these things is why there at the moment there is not the rise of a Reform or Alternative to Deutschland or Sweden, the National Democrats, even though the Liberal Party vote collapsed further. There was only, in the end, a slight rise in the Freedom minor parties. I mean, One Nation, it went up nationwide. We won't know if they'll get a few extra senators until that supercomputer button is pressed. But One Nation, it doesn't seem, it's been around for almost 30 years, that it's going to explode like the Reform Party is. And it's continued to gather support, even though Nigel Farage has fallen out with Rupert Lowe. I mean, there's been when these sorts of fallouts have happened with One Nation, they've dented it quite significantly.
Yeah, look, there are different. For example, there's a North African immigration issue in Europe, which we haven't experienced to the same degree, and that has led to terrorist attacks. Well, we have experienced some in Australia, and if you put the same elements together, you'll actually get the same result, right? So I think we will probably get some more of them in due course, as well as low-level violence. I mean, there was never any talk when I was growing up about people wielding machetes in major metropolitan cities, but now that's simply something that is reported routinely in the news in Australia. So it's not great out there, and Europe also didn't have a mining boom, so its deindustrialization occurred without any sort of compensatory source of wealth. Now, I think our chickens will come home to roost eventually, but we have been lucky in that respect economically. So the same exactly, and then we were, in theory at least, not part of the European. We were part of the European Union, signing up to a whole lot of other institutions. So there wasn't this big cataclysmic kind of event, which was something that a minor party could seize on to. Yes, the Voice, but the Liberal Party also was against the Voice too. So it wasn't something that only.
I think that was a factor of that. The Australian people, they always have a lot of goodwill, but the way that the Aboriginal industry behaved in the lead up to that referendum demanding more, the goodwill that Australians had, and also the fact that they'd already been given so much. Australia doesn't have affirmative action except for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, I think.
Oh, I don't know about that. Oh, we have our DEI programs.
Well, they're not to the same extent as, say, the United States, where there's black-owned businesses get special treatment. I certainly think with there's these Aboriginal high labor companies, I definitely think there's been this whether
that was the explanation. I mean, I think some of the migrant communities actually didn't understand why a particular group should be getting preferences, even if they happen to be quote unquote Indigenous. I think that was sentiment shared amongst the white population, or however you want to describe us. Then, so that's why you had a dramatic result. But but we were discussing why there hasn't been a reform style party here. And, if the two major parties had both been in favor of the voice, I think that would have dramatically boosted One Nation stocks or another political party.
And the voice would have been
but I
in
think
place for, say, 18 months, and we would have seen how bad it would be, and we're stuck with it.
Well, it still may not have passed with the two parties in favor of, even so. But that, if you're looking for an explanation about why, but look, I think that the elements are building and yes, we're different. The US had its big surprise Trump election in 2016. If that hadn't happened, there wouldn't have been the realignment.
But Brexit also was in the same
that's
year.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Both of them occurred at the same time, and that sort of was a cataclysm. But we didn't have the same type of event. I mean, people try to make out that the voice was the same, but it wasn't quite as dramatic as those two other events, and didn't prompt a broad-based rethinking on trade and immigration foreign policy.
I think it has
like
on
the Trump election
Aboriginal affairs, definitely.
Yeah. But that's something that can be fitted into the liberal kind of mindset as well. Like liberals, we're all individuals, should be treated the same. So that's an area where kind of conservatives and liberals have considerable overlap. But I don't think the vote on the voice didn't prompt a rethinking on trade the way that a Trump election did or a Brexit event did, right? And it didn't. The voice didn't really prompt a re-examination on immigration. It didn't really have any consequences for foreign policy. So it wasn't quite as broad-based it was a
single issue.
Yeah.
You're right that certainly in terms of the economy, things are not as bad as they are, particularly in the UK, where you think our energy bills have gone up. I mean, it's even worse in the UK. And it's not that I don't want things to become worse. I'm not one of these accelerationists, because we all have to live through it. And also, thankfully, in Australia, it's very rare for people to be locked up instantly for wrong thick or misgendering, another difference. And also,
it's coming, Tim, if it's not already. There are people that have lost their jobs over objecting to this stuff. It's out there. I don't think we should discount the real risk.
I'm saying in the UK, it's on another level. Regularly, the police turning up. You posted something bad online. It still happens here in Australia, but they go for the.
They can define what they know what a woman is in law now, though. We don't in Australia.
So I think that's because there hasn't been these police arresting women for misgendering and sort of, again, it's Australians are a lot more sort of passive on these sorts of issues. I mean, they were happy, they were so compliant when it came to lockdown.
Yeah, I'm all for promoting Australian our great qualities, but I just would caution that we experience, there are people who live and have experienced legal issues because of their views on gender ideology. People have lost their jobs. It's certainly not it's a hostile environment for anyone who expresses those views in corporate Australia. That's against.
I'm not discounting at all that. We have so many anti-free speech laws, but the point that I'm making is that as of yet, there hasn't been this massive overreach like there has been in the UK. I mean, it could be coming.
There are some egregious examples in the UK, but I do think let's just cool our jets a little bit, because we're not quite.
Here in Australia, the authorities pick on what they think are the easy targets, the National Socialist Network, because nobody likes Nazis, so it's all good to arrest them for staging a protest. That's the sort of mindset. While
Yeah, but you have people whose lives have been destroyed. I had Sal Grover on the other day. Her business has been destroyed because she won't let a man who wants to identify as a woman, to call himself a woman on her app program. You have people like Gillian Spencer, a maid, who got stood down from her long-standing role as a child psychiatrist because she challenged, the puberty blockers for kids. I mean, all this stuff, they are consequences. And I sort of feel like the UK tabloid press does give some of their stories a good run.
This is the other thing.
And there are some particularly egregious examples over there as well, especially in relation to suing people for online comments. But, during COVID here, we had police knocking on doors because people were posting, stuff on their Facebook accounts, and famously dragged a, mum out of her room because she was against, lockdowns. I mean, like we are pretty nuts. We're good in some ways, and we're probably ahead of people in others, and we're about the same in many respects. I just think it's, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and I don't think we should sort of rest on our laurels on these things or presume that we're in such a better place than many of these other places are.
Well, you mentioned the tabloids in the UK. They really they highlight what was happening, and the UK has had so much more conservative infrastructure. I mean, the Spectator magazine over there is much larger of an institution than the one here. There's both GB News and Talk TV. There's all these institutes. I mean, here we just sort of have the Spectator Australia, the Institute of Public Affairs, and Sky News.
We have us Sky, so-called Sky After Dark, as they like to refer to it, is better than Sky in the UK, but they have GB News, which is different. There is a broader conservative intellectual infrastructure in the UK, and there's some fine people who make beautiful arguments, but they haven't actually had much of a much better result in the UK than here. They've been particularly good in recent times on fighting back against the gender stuff.
I think that's why even after the Supreme Court ruling in the UK, the Starmer government said we're not going to amend the Equality Act because...
Yeah, and you've got a lot of money with people like J.K. Rowling pushing it and stuff. I just caution the UK. I'm quite skeptical in many ways about the UK intelligentsia. They're very, we have the Rory Stewarts who come out here and give lectures, and they have a posh accent, and they can, some lovely anecdotes that they picked up in their Tony, very expensive schools. But the net result is that I think their politics in Westminster, at least, is much more performative than ours. Ours is, for all its faults, a little bit more focused on concrete stuff. And the net, the actual end result in many cases, we have had better policy in many ways than the UK, but under John Howard and even under, some of the other governments. But, but it is impressive that they have. There are some fine people making some fine commentary out of there. They're a bigger nation. They have a long-standing, and London is obviously like a combination of almost Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne in terms of its scale. So you get economies of scale when you bring such a large portion of people together. But I also think we discount ourselves. There's some people who make excellent arguments here in Australia, excellent journos. But structurally, we don't. It's hard for them to sort of go and give lectures in Harvard with a posh accent like Douglas Murray does, because I don't know, they don't want to hear it from an Aussie. They want to hear you want to hear about the collapse of Britain and a warning from Britain about the future of America by
I get what you mean with there's too much talking. I mean, the middle class in Britain has been gutted while it's declining in Australia, and the fact that Peter Dutton, he tried to make the case, link housing to immigration, saying this is how we make housing more affordable, but again I think he was outmaneuvered by the Labor left, who say you can't get houses, young people, because all the boomers are hoarding all of the housing, not letting not letting their houses get demolished to build units and townhouses.
Yeah, I mean, the immigration would solve so many of these issues, but our economy is just addicted to it. If we were to dramatically cut immigration, it's the simplest solution that is on offer. It's possible to do. It would make the university experience better. It would cut rents. It would make the prospect of young people being able to afford homes more viable. It would improve social cohesion. It would actually improve productivity as well. It would boost wages. There's all these pluses to it. And it's just, it boggles my mind that it's not possible for mainstream politicians to be able to make these cases, directly and consistently and in a way that gets implemented into real laws.
It doesn't seem like I don't see much incentive, like the Liberal and National parties, particularly the Liberal Party, they just seem to be happy with the status quo, and we'll just wait for Labor to screw the economy and then we'll eventually get back into government that way.
Yeah, it's not going to fly. That was the theory at the last election, where they were just going to be like a small target and rely on Albo's supposed unpopularity, and look where it got them. It got them a record loss, and there just hasn't been. I mean, Andrew Hastie appeared on the John Curtin Institute podcast recently, and those guys, I disagree with them on lots of different things, but they are aware about how the policy framework needs to change from the 1990s. I don't believe many of our think tank on the centre right or the baby boomer Liberal Party grandees, probably too harsh a word, but whatever, and even even large sections of the sort of Financial Review and the Australian editorial page have really grasped the new politics. They will eventually, because although it's kind of going to smack them in the face pretty hard and pretty fast pretty soon.
Yeah, Cosamares, who hosts that podcast, like obviously you and I disagree with, well, he is happy for the new Australia, and he says demographics is his destiny, and like he was an ex-Labor campaign director. And you're right that the centre right in Australia, Conservatives, there hasn't been this adaptation, and hopefully in the next 3 years the National Conservative Institute of Australia can play its part. What's your plans for the next 3 years? Are you going to have events or?
Well, there's lots of people and who. I just think genuinely the space is wide open, because people don't really understand traditional conservatism in the full sense. I do think it is the answer to a lot of our current ills, and I will have articles in in newspapers in the next day or so, which people can read. There's a stack of articles that have been written on the National Conservative website, nationalconservatism.org.au. I do a series of podcasts with a whole lot of interesting thinkers who say sensible things, that aren't trying to necessarily get as many clicks as possible or chase the particular issue du jour. It's a different type of conversation that people have on Sky News. It's a more lengthy one. But I think people will enjoy it and find it interesting, and genuinely, I think they will recognize we are saying something new, and many of the points that we make are issues that areas that do require a reconsideration and correction in the centre right in Australia.
And I'll put the links to those in the show notes page. I'll put them in the live chat. Thank you so much for joining me, Dan, tonight, and providing your insight and analysis. And I hope to hear more about the National Conservative Institute of Australia going forward.
A pleasure, Tim. I appreciate all you do. I'll sign it now.
Thank you.
Take it easy. Bye.
All right, everybody, that is WilmsFront for another week. Now there'll be a fresh report from Tiger Mountain with Richard Wollstonecroft tomorrow. It'll be his review of The Handmaid's Tale going into the final season. So he always likes to do a film or television review. And obviously it seems that the far left, they love that show. They love to watch things about, lefty feminists love to watch shows about them getting oppressed. And they also like to claim that Donald Trump's doing it to them. And now I'll be back next on Monday for Tim's News Explosion, same time, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time on the WilmsFront channels. Make sure you click the bell to allow for notifications, this episode, and also leave a comment below because it all helps with the algorithm. Of course, if you want to support us here at the Unshackled, you can take out a premium membership over on the unshackled.net/membership. So we have bronze $5 per month, silver $10 per month, gold $25 per month, or platinum $50 per month. Or you can take out a yearly membership. So $50 per year, $100 per year, $250 per year, or $500 per year. And the unshackled.net is where I post all Unshackled articles. And our Unshackled Productions archive at the moment is over on Substack. So the unshackled.substack.com/subscribe. So there's monthly $5 per month, annual $50 per year. And you can be a founding member for $500 per year, or you can simply sign up for free to get the email alerts, because that's where I email alerts about WilmsFront and other upcoming Unshackled productions. So that's it for tonight. Stay safe, stay sane, stay free. Hopefully there was not too much blackpilling on my behalf tonight. As you all know, I like to analyze things how they are, not necessarily how I'd like them to be. But I still am optimistic about Australia's future. I love this country, and I certainly want to see it advance and be the best that it can be, and a nation which we're all very proud of. So good night, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com to view the archive of episodes, and keep visiting the unshackled.net to view all our shows, and to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.